Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 1040. Fall of the Protection Wall. Help! Ag! A sickening squelch cut through the terrifying cry for help, and the head of yet another protector rolled across the icy ground from a single foot stomp. The owner of that foot, with his dark, joyless eyes, stared toward the remaining protectors standing opposite him, gripping their weapons with desperate resolve. His long black hair danced softly in the bitter wind of the western border as he glided across the snow, pressing fresh crimson blood into the pristine ground. He stopped halfway while the remaining soldiers stood at a distance, trembling slightly. Though the look in their eyes tried to mask it, they were terrified. Their killer, standing before them, sighed and shook his head, clicking his tongue in disgust. This could have gone the easy way. Do you all realize that? He gestured slightly with his hand. I explained clearly. I did not come here to fight you. I only came here to claim the protection wall. Their faces hardened as he studied them. He sighed again. I really am tired of all of you and your stubbornness. Ruffsberg was the founder of the Protectors, yes? They all stared at him, their weapons still raised. They did not respond, but he was right. You think that old wasted fool created this place to truly protect the continent? They remained silent, but he continued regardless. The separation of Stelia and the decision to make it a continent of its own because of its distance from the rest, that came as shocking. But in the long run, it served to fuel my plan perfectly. Ruffsberg created this place for the same reason. Well, not exactly the same, but something similar. The wall is a containment of essence. All of you are containment. Let me make it easier for you brainless creatures to understand. You are all food. Not just any kind of food, but that which has been nourished by the world itself. The leakage in this place, you have all been subconsciously absorbing it for years. Whether alive or dead, you will serve as the initial source of essence restoration for the origin of war. Karl breathed deeply, happiness dancing in his eyes. And the atmospheric anomaly of the western border? Oh well, that is something Professor Heimberger helped me develop to weaken the intangible prison my master was trapped in. Karl shook his head. That man is brilliant. Every plan he shared with me 80 years ago went exactly as he predicted. Brilliant, in fact, seems to diminish his great mind. Karl finally exhaled and looked forward again. His eyes fell on a particularly familiar young man. The man had a full beard, his eyes were fiery and sharp. Beside him stood two young women with dark hair and piercing venomous eyes, each wearing protectors' uniforms just as he was. Gilbert, right? Gilbert frowned. How do you know my name? What are your ties with Ruffsberg? Karl examined him with downturned lips. Do you know that he is back? As a luminary, Ruffsberg, that is. Gilbert's eyes widened for a moment. Then he controlled himself and frowned again. And why are you telling me? Karl smiled. Did you not used to be his dog? Or are you finally rebelling? Gilbert's gaze hardened, a furious light blazing in his eyes. I do not think I owe you, stranger, murderer, and twisted demon, any explanations for my actions. The only thing I owe you is death, and even if it is the last thing I do, I will make sure I give it to you. Karl regarded him, smiling maliciously. Look at you. Aren't you adorable? Gilbert opened his hands, manifesting two long swords into them. His face was already worn out, but it wasn't from facing Karl. After leaving the border, he had gone to the academy hoping he could pursue a teaching career or something similar. However, he was vehemently refused by the principal, ridiculously at the gate. He wasn't even granted entry into the school. Gilbert returned to Verilania to claim his public citadel, but another headmaster had already been transferred there by the government, which wasn't surprising. It was as though there was no place for him no matter where he went. He was seemingly rejected by one circumstance or another. They had even tried opening a small roadside stall to sell late-night noodles, but the stall was destroyed by the authorities and a new law against such practices was released. After contemplating for a long time, Gilbert decided the best thing for him to do was return to the border and live the rest of his life protecting the Central Plains. He had bid Au and Mew farewell, but those two young girls were incredibly stubborn. Deciding to return to the wall, Gilbert believed it was the best decision he had ever made in his life. Apparently, after the Dark Continent student returned, the situation of monsters climbing from the sea to the surface had doubled. Before, monsters rarely surfaced. It happened perhaps once or twice every 3 weeks. However, since the students' return, monsters emerged every day. If they were unlucky, they had to battle a destroyer. If they had rotten luck, then the destroyer would be abysmal, or worse, apex, rising to the surface with an army of its own. Gilbert and the Protectors had just finished dealing with 2 abysmal maelstrom and 1 catastrophic hellion. Many were wounded, even Gilbert himself, and yet This person had suddenly attacked. And he knows Ruffsburg. Gilbert tried not to overthink it. He knew Ruffsburg had lived for a long time. They could be acquainted in any number of ways. But the things he was saying about the wall's creation were difficult to dismiss. The problem about the atmospheric leakage was accurate. If he was right about that, then he was probably also correct that all of them were food. Gilbert exhaled shakily. What in the world is going on? How can I send a message to Northern? He paused his thoughts at that moment. Northern? How shameless can I be? Something goes wrong and the first person I look to for help is a 16-year-old. Or is he 17? I wonder how he's doing these days. How strong he is. Gilbert remained silent for a few seconds, then suddenly got an idea that made him frown. He glanced at both girls at his side and lowered his stance slightly as though ready to move, but also positioning himself so he could whisper to them comfortably. Oh, Mew, listen to me clearly. Chapter 1041. The Last Stand. I am going to unleash everything I have on him. In the meantime, I want you to run. Lights blazed in Ayu's focused eyes. Oh great, we'll be running together. For a moment Gilbert's eyes turned somber. It was becoming difficult to convey his plan to the girls. He knew how attached they were to him. He had found them and raised them since they were children, which was precisely why he needed them to live. He wanted them to live for themselves at least for once. And if this meant this would be his last stand, then so be it. He had no regrets. No, you two will be going alone. Mew's face darkened immediately. Don't you even dare. While Ayu whispered, Gilbert. Meanwhile Gilbert sighed. He paused for a moment and explained. Listen girls. First of all you have to trust me. I won't die from this bastard. Come on, I am strong. Secondly, I believe this goes beyond what's happening here. I want to give both of you a crucial assignment. Gilbert's gaze swept over the two of them. In Verulania, at the bunker beneath our citadel. There's a safe. In that safe there's detailed documentation of everything Ruffsburg has been doing, information that might lead us to his ultimate goal. Which I believe he has no idea of because he himself is being manipulated. If you uncover this truth and take it to Annette, I'm certain it will be invaluable to her. Trust me enough to come meet you girls. Mew's expression turned murderous. Do you think I'm a... Mew? The steel and finality in Gilbert's voice made her freeze. Oh glanced between them, then looked at Mew. Let's trust Gilbert, all right, Mew? Gilbert looked at her and smiled. The smile was heartbreaking, but he masked it. Call's voice sliced through the cold night. If you're done with your farewells, please. I beg you. Come at me. Let's wrap this up. I have somewhere to be. Gilbert looked at his two girls for the last time and turned forward, both swords gleaming in his hands. His powerful voice thundered. Protectors. Instantly everyone around turned to him. Both the wounded and those cowering behind with terror. Gilbert was the only sage at the wall. Over the past few months he had snatched countless protectors from death's jaws, and many subjugation missions had succeeded because he came to the wall. His importance was so immense that many protectors believed they wouldn't have survived the intensified monster invasion without Gilbert's presence alone, which proved just how devastating a sage could be. His voice alongside the wall commanders was pure hope to the soldiers. We are the last line. We are the blade that does not bend, the shield that does not break. The protectors' expressions transformed. Danzo was the first to rise, clutching his sword with iron resolve burning in his eyes as he carried the next words. We do not turn. We do not flee. We are the ones who remain. The wall commander himself groaned and stood. His voice rode the winds and echoed across the battlefield. If the stars fall and the heavens weep, if the land trembles and all others fade, still we hold. Next, soldiers who were on their knees sprawled on the ground began to rise. Groaning, many drenched in blood, but they stood, resolve blazing in their eyes. They carried the pledge in unison. For the blood that runs behind us. For the homes that lie untouched. For the breath of children yet unborn. We give our flesh, our fire, our final breath. Mew scowled as she muttered the words with the others. Tears glistened in her eyes and threatened to spill, but she crushed them down, still muttering as the thunderous voices of the mass carried the pledge like a monolith of tremendous power. Should this be the end, let it be said. We stood. We fought. We did not yield. Here at the edge. Let death come. We are already eternal. Then Gilbert's voice erupted with devastating power. Who stands at the end? The protectors roared. We stand. Gilbert bellowed again. What do we hold? The protectors responded. The line. Gilbert stepped forward, fixing Call with a fierce and defiant glare. One that declared, even though we die, we will never die. Then he thundered again. What do we give? The soldiers screamed at the top of their lungs. Everything. With battle cries and savage screams they surged forward, all of them charging toward a single man who stood in the cold night with a blank and indifferent expression. Call spat on the ground. Tsk. Pathetic. He merely snapped his fingers. And obsidian swords erupted from the earth, cleaving through men as they charged forward. The blades blurred as they soared through the air of their own accord. Amidst the chaos, Mew seized Au and the two of them shot backward, escaping through the carnage. Both were incredibly nimble, their movement speed and timing perfectly synchronized without needing to look at each other. They weaved between the flying swords, dodging, twisting, until they fled the massacre and plunged into the frigid forest of the western border. They paused one last time, Mew glancing back with a scowl. Au looked at her and smiled. Gilbert will be all right. Mew exhaled sharply and turned forward. The two of them resumed their escape. Au was a gentle soul, naive too. Mew was the one who had allowed the world's harshness and brutality to harden her. That's why she could see the cold truth behind Gilbert's decision. She believed that perhaps Au sometimes deluded herself so she could remain free from the agony of how vicious the world truly was. It tormented her that her sister was so kind and innocent. Whoever that bastard who had attacked them was, he had slaughtered over 600 drifters effortlessly. That was not a feat achievable by any sage. He had butchered so many of them without breaking a sweat. Mew was certain that man could easily crush a sage. And she knew Gilbert understood that too. Which was why he had sent them both away. Today Gilbert and the protectors of the wall would die. And she wasn't even sure she could call it a glorious death, because the very person who had placed them there might be the reason they were all dying. She wiped her eyes as both of them sprinted forward with blazing speed. Still a tear escaped from the corner of her eye, glistening in the cold night wind as it flew away. Chapter 1042. Sisters in Distress. Several days and nights passed. Au and Mew spent them braving the horrors of the forest. The forest barricaded the western border from the main continent and teemed with dangerous abominations. It was no surprise that the rift ratio around the border, all the way to the Dark Continent, was 10 times that of the center of the Central Plains. Still, that information Mew felt was an understatement for how truly perilous the border was. Sleeping at night was a gamble, so they traveled preferably during the night and had to slaughter nocturnal abominations that hurled themselves at them. There were others who were meticulous and cunning in their approach. Those ones cost the girls more effort, but in the end they were still within their capacity. Since Au and Mew themselves were savants, almost breaking into sages. Plus the girls could share their vision and senses easily with each other, their brains were in perfect synchronization. Thus the coordination they had made killing abominations quite effortless. The ones that were unkillable, their coordination made it quite easy for them to flee from. And thus they ended up spending 3 grueling days in the forest before finally breaking into the city. Or at least they expected that they would break into a city. Mew stared at the barren plain in front of her with confusion. She had heard that Fugal was a thriving city with voices and colors of people ever vibrant and dancing in the sky. Either day or night there was almost never a difference. However, what she was looking at was a stark contrast from what she was told. A stark contrast was an understatement. There was nothing there. Mew? Au sounded tense and confused. Mew understood why, because if Fugal was empty, the cities were gone, the people were gone, the walls were gone, even the rivers were gone. Then definitely the warp station was gone. So how exactly were they supposed to travel? The warp station was supposed to lead them to Drywall, which would make it easier to travel to Variolania. However, there was nothing. We might have to continue our journey on foot. Au looked at her sister, whose voice rang with resolve. Although Mew showed no weakness in her sharp dark eyes, Au knew that she was currently struggling internally for her sake. She touched Mew's clenched fist, making her open it, and they locked fingers. How long will it take for us to get to Variolania on foot? Mew exhaled softly. I'm thinking 7 days. To get to Drywall first, then from Drywall we should find transportation to Variolania. Au tapped her sister's hand gently. Don't worry, Mew. We will get there in time, and who knows? We might get lucky and meet some nomads on the way. They will make traveling way easier, you know. We are no nomads though. But we will certainly make your traveling easier. Au and Mew paused, looking at each other. They tilted their heads because the voice they heard belonged to neither of them. With a sharp and almost imperceptible movement they turned and were already armed with their weapons. Au stood before the stranger, Mew stood behind. The person who had spoken though was unfazed, unsurprised, and unbothered by their actions. Most of her body was her head was covered with her scarf, and another scarf wrapped her neck and lower face, revealing only her crimson eyes. The eyes. They were calm, but glowing with lethality. Staring directly into the eyes made chills race down Au's spine. She frowned and slightly averted her gaze from the stranger. Who are you? The stranger tilted their head. Their voice was both chilling and honeyed. It was very unsettling for them both. I am merely a passerby. I happened to be going to Drywall and heard you both. Would you like to travel together? Au and Mew glanced at each other. A sharp, quick flash of their eyes. Then both sighed at the exact same time. The stranger was still standing between them, unperturbed. Even though they looked like they were in control, they were the ones who seemed most disturbed. It was not safe, especially with how unsettling this person made them feel. Mew did not want to put her sister in danger. However, if there was any chance they could travel faster or safer, she was also willing to take it. With considerable skepticism, of course. So, how exactly are you traveling? Where are you traveling to? The stranger stirred slightly, making both of them snap back to extreme high alert, their gazes sharpening like cold blades under the moonlight. I came to Fugle because I heard my brother is here. As the first daughter of the family, I have a responsibility I have neglected for years. I hope to find him and bring him home. Au and Mew exchanged glances while the stranger continued. However, seeing that he is not here, I just have to keep searching until I find him. Au was the first to crack, her face softening with compassion. You are very determined. I like that. Mew frowned at her sister. Au. Immediately the girl shifted. She frowned and glared with hostility. Right? You could be lying to us. The stranger scoffed. What could I possibly gain from lying to you? I do not even know you. I am just offering my help, you do not need to take it. The stranger then shifted and turned. As she turned, something landed with crushing force from the sky, sending dust billowing around them. As the dust cleared, a young lady knelt on one knee like a war angel cast in dark steel. Her platinum blonde hair was tousled and caught the harsh light that filtered through the smoke. Golden eyes burned with fierce determination in her pale, dirt-streaked face. The gaze of someone who had seen too much but refused to break. Your Highness. We have searched far and wide. There's not a single survivor in Fugle, just a single building in the center of the city, and it is unoccupied. The stranger waved slightly. Yui? The lady responded sharply. He is on his way. Barely a second after she had said that, the growl of an engine roared to life. Massive thick tires effortlessly crushed rubble and rolled forward with tremendous force. The carrier was like an abomination on wheels. Well, one could not particularly say it wasn't, since it was forged using the metallic carapace of a behemoth. Even the windscreens were reinforced using viscous liquid squeezed from the organs of terrifying abominations. Its hull was shaped like the prow of a warship, every plate of matte black armor sloped and deliberate, forged not just for protection but for intimidation. No windshield, no face. Only a slit of reinforced sensor optics glinting faintly like a serpent's eye beneath storm clouds. It did not look like it drove through cities. It looked like it crushed them. On the right flank, a side panel disengaged with a series of mechanical clanks. The armor shifted, rotated, then folded outward, revealing a compact access point from which a young boy with wild, untamed dark hair dismounted. The boy stood upright and saluted. "Aye, Captain." Au and Mew stared at each other and at the strange, ferocious mechanical beast. Chapter 1043. Talent of the Continent. In a vast plain marred by monster corpses and viscous crimson blood carving river paths along the dark terrain stood a man. The man exhaled softly, cold air streaming from his nostrils. He carried silence like a weapon, sharp, deliberate, and always within reach. He was dressed in flowing black robes that rippled like ink in motion as he walked forward. Every step he took carried the kind of stillness that made sound seem impolite. His hair, jet black and carelessly tied into a loose topknot, betrayed the elegance of someone who didn't seek attention, but couldn't avoid it either. Golden eyes flickered beneath his dark bangs, not with warmth but with calculation. There was no rage in them, no mercy either, only awareness. Barely 5 steps into motion, a lady materialized behind him. She stood like a cathedral cloaked in dusk, solemn, dignified, and quietly radiant. Her skin, deep and warm like polished mahogany, contrasted beautifully with the long silken veil of white hair that framed her face in disciplined strands. A single braid fell over her shoulder, immaculate and controlled, much like the expression she wore. Composed but laced with something unspoken. She seemed to hesitate, but when she eventually spoke, her voice was like the sweetness of lilies, if they could ever speak. "Headmaster, we have completely eradicated all of them." The young man tilted his head slightly, his eyes somewhat distant. "Have we been able to establish communication with other branch citadels?" "Terran has been working on it for 2 days now with no progress." The young man slipped one hand into his robe. "So it might not be a technology issue." The lady nodded slightly. "That's what he said as well." The young man looked up at the golden light seeping through the sky. It was the dawn of the 3rd day since the attack had begun in the kingdom of Welster. Welster was one of the nations with enough power to stand on its own and rebel against the Empire. It was one of the 4 nations of the Old Tower Alliance and was the nation where the strongest citadel in the Central Plains had established its base. Eli Calvin was the headmaster of the Calvin Citadel and one of the existing paragons of the Central Plains. Not the new immature ones, the ones as strong as Rizel or the Kageyama clan patriarch. "Naya." His voice was warm and smooth. "Headmaster." The lady responded with gentle urgency. There was silence for a while as Eli continued to stare into the sky. "There's a moving fortress in the sky." Immediately Naya raised her head. Her ash-toned eyes narrowed and she clenched the hilt of the sword on her waist. Her long cape fluttered as she lowered herself into stance, ready to unleash a deadly onslaught. Even the wind seemed to part. "Should I tear it down?" He continued to stare upward. I doubt you'll be able to. Naya frowned. Eli knew her abilities better than anyone. Even though she was only an ascendant, she had just defeated 6 ascendants on her own. Though they were military dogs with much to learn, she had nonetheless defeated 6 ascendants single-handedly. She would fare well, and she believed she could defeat the paragons leading the ascendants if only the headmaster allowed her. But Eli had handled those himself and allowed the Citadel elites to take care of the others. He had also eliminated every destroyer and behemoth assisted by 3 of the elites. Naya had been too late to join that side of the fray because she was busy with 6 ascendants. The point was she was lethal poison. Forget her graceful curves and the gentleness that suggested the makings of a princess. She was a force of swift and intoxicating destruction on the battlefield. Everyone knew this, so she trusted that if the headmaster doubted her ability, then she really needed to be careful. A wicked, endearing grin formed on her striking face, her silver lashes and ash eyes glinting. It seems I must exceed my limits today. Perhaps today is the day I become a paragon. Eli turned to her with a pale and blank expression. She frowned. What? He shook his head. You are miles away from that, Naya. Naya glared at him with the light of resolve blazing in her eyes. I will become a paragon very soon. Meanwhile, as they argued, the flying fortress was descending. Strangely, there was no violent displacement of air as the concrete vessel slowly descended to the ground. On the rim of the airship sat a white-haired boy cross-legged and staring down with a distant look in his blue eyes. Eli's eyes met his for a moment and both seemed to silently gauge each other. One from above, one from below. The ship was now closer to the ground than ever. Eli and the boy were still locked in their stare. Naya remained on high alert, her hand on her sword, and her eyes fixed on the boy sitting on the edge of the ship's bow. She studied him for several seconds, observing and analyzing. But it was as though he was blank before her. Her eyes, razor-sharp at seeing the core of one's soul, could not pierce into the boy's soul core. It was as though he had none. All she could see was a vast emptiness, something that terrified her and sent chills down her spine. Her focus shattered when Eli released a small nervous chuckle. Oh shoot. She glanced at her headmaster. Headmaster, is everything all right? Eli didn't respond. He merely watched as the ship finally touched the ground and stilled. Then the boy sitting on it descended softly, flowing down like the wind itself. He looked to his subordinate and spoke to her with a firm tone as the boy approached. Naya, do not do anything rash or stupid. In fact, do not do anything at all right? Naya hesitated. Yes, sir. The headmaster was usually composed even in the face of any disaster, but she had been with him for over 15 years. She knew when he wasn't composed, when he was uncertain, when he felt fear. There had been many such times when they were much younger, but since becoming a sage he had changed completely. Eli almost never got scared of anything or responded emotionally to anything. Until today. And that very fact alone made her deeply scared and wary of the person walking toward them. Finally the person reached them and bowed slightly. Behind him other people were also descending. And Naya could even recognize someone among them. Isn't that Celis? Northern glanced back and responded. Oh yes, she definitely is. And I am Rian. I hear they call me the talent of the continent. Chapter 1044. Assertion of Power. After leaving Milwa Island and the ruined academy, the plan had been to head to South Drywall, where Northern's acquaintances, and possibly family, waited so they could strategize and determine their next move. However, upon reaching Verullania, they discovered the city was once again under siege. Moreover, Ascendant Zion and the Drifters had suffered devastating damage. Byran alone plunged into the raging battlefield in Verullania and crushed it within 10 minutes. Afterward, they settled in Verullania briefly. Linus and Jessi briefed them, reporting the bizarre shadow storm and its erratic behavior. It had nearly annihilated them all, then suddenly retreated and vanished without a trace. Then another wave of monsters swarmed them. Many perished, but Braham was instrumental in minimizing their casualties. For once he was intensely focused and didn't demand outrageous compensation to save lives. He recognized they were in dire straits, so he acted with urgency, and they all fought together to preserve one another. Though it seemed almost effortless, they nearly died until Byran descended into the fray. Afterward they continued toward Drywall, only to discover another nation just beyond vast Verullania, also under vicious monster assault. This time only Abyss Tyrant ended the carnage, and they pressed on. Their journey slowed drastically as they began intervening in every battle they encountered until they reached Welster. Beyond Welster they believed they would finally reach Drywall, at least according to Ascendant Zion and Celis, who knew the Central Plain better than most. Along the way, after a day, Northern also awakened and joined the mission to neutralize threats. He understood the stakes. The sooner they could halt these battles, the faster Chaos would stop feeding Cryos the strength he needed to break free. Northern had contemplated the sinister bond both father and son shared with Chaos. Not far-fetched, considering Cryos might have devoured his son to become an origin. Before that transformation he was connected to bloodshed and madness, which explained why he could master chaos as an origin. What Northern didn't yet understand was why Cryos had been imprisoned. Countless rumors surrounded the reason. The other origins considered him an outcast and had never trusted him. He was too dangerous, so they locked him away. Northern refused to believe any of it yet. But he suspected the most plausible reason was simply that Cryos was an origin of chaos. Should chaos have an origin embodied in physical form? Wouldn't that create catastrophic imbalance? The same applied to Void. Weren't both forces too primordial to be contained? These were merely Northern's musings. He believed they needed to understand their enemy to defeat it, so he was already preparing for the worst-case scenario. They all were. They were preparing to battle an origin. And they were grateful it was only one. The atmosphere had grown tense and Northern had been obsessing over how to grow stronger. Specifically over Endless. That's why he sat perched on the ship's bow when it descended. Northern stood considerably taller than Eli, forcing the man to crane his neck slightly. Rian. The boy the scouts mentioned, the one with multiple talents? He sounded mildly surprised. I heard you were quite young though. 17 according to your profile. Northern nodded. I am 17. Eli stared with uncertainty, squinting. You can't possibly be. Northern smiled. I am. Meanwhile Naya spotted Celis Vorn approaching. Celis, you were supposed to return 4 days ago. What happened? Naya could barely restrain herself. The only reason she remained beside Eli was because it was Eli. Every fiber of her being wanted to leap forward and embrace the approaching young woman. Celis bowed respectfully. Lady Naya, I apologize. Much transpired. Behind them Ascendant Zion, Jessi, Linus, Raven, Annette, Vita, Helena, and Byran also arrived. Naya embraced Celis, examining her with tender care, while Northern surveyed their surroundings. It seems the Calvin Citadel has provided Welster with all necessary aid. Eli slipped his other hand into his robe and straightened, studying Northern. Yes. Most enemies have been slaughtered. The scattered remnants in other cities are being eliminated. Northern's smile broadened with satisfaction. Excellent. It's reassuring to know there are dependable allies. Eli stared at him, blinking. This boy, that's quite humble of you to say considering you're a sage. You think the world needs you to survive? Northern regarded him blankly, then laughed. A brief sharp sound. His expression hardened as he locked eyes with the headmaster. I didn't used to. But recently I've realized the world does need me to survive. The world cannot endure without me. Over 3 days my crew and I have rescued 11 nations from annihilation. While you've remained here, in your homeland, defending it alone. He fixed the man with an indifferent stare, though a dangerous glint flickered in his eyes. Not every nation has a paragon. In fact, most places my crew and I saved didn't even have an ascendant. Northern glanced at the lady, then back at Eli. Yet you had multiple paragons to assist you. Seriously, be realistic. Nothing was particularly humble about my statement. It was simply factual. Eli and Naya fell silent. The boy had struck home. If his claims were true, that he'd saved 11 nations in 3 days while they'd spent those same days fighting solely for themselves, then weren't they the ones being presumptuous to challenge his words? Eli lowered his head slightly. I apologize, Sage Rian. I misunderstood. Northern frowned. Huh? He apologized? He'd never expected such a direct approach to actually work. He'd assumed everyone in the Central Plains was fiercely proud, especially paragons. Somehow people consistently underestimated his power when facing him. Or was he the one who hadn't been assertive enough about it? This encounter made him question that assumption. It's quite all right, sir. Northern scanned the area one final time. There's little happening here now, so I believe we're free to depart. Northern stepped back, but the headmaster called out. Sage Rian. Northern half-turned, paused, and faced the young man again. Yes? Do you know what's happening? With the Central Plains, Northern shrugged. A tyrant is using our continent as farmland to cultivate chaos for an Origins prison break. Well, it's nearly succeeded actually. I doubt anything we do will stop it at this point. Chapter 1045. Provocation. Eli's mouth fell open slightly. He came across as someone whom nothing could shock. The golden light in his eyes seemed like they had witnessed the end of the world and survived the crushing weight of that knowledge. However, right now he was staring at Northern in stunned disbelief, his eyes wide, blinking repeatedly. I'm sorry, Sage Rian, do you know what a tyrant is? An origin most especially. These are not just common terminologies. Northern looked at him with barely suppressed annoyance. I am well aware of what I'm talking about. Eli scratched his head, chuckling dryly. He turned away for a moment and spun back as if he'd lost his sense of direction. Shit. We're done for? What origin exactly? Which tyrant exactly? Northern stared at him with a slightly conflicted expression. He hesitated. The origin of chaos. As for the tyrant, I think he relates to blood and madness. I'm not sure. This is merely my own speculation. The moment Northern mentioned chaos, Eli's eyes widened even more, his face draining of color. What's wrong with him? Definitely Eli knew something. Most people aside from Ruffsburg that Northern had spoken to, even those who knew about the existence of origins and tyrants, hadn't reacted this way. Eli staggered back, covering his mouth as it fell agape. Yeah, he knows something. Northern stepped closer and smiled politely. Headmaster of Calvin Citadel, I sincerely think you should come with us. Eli looked at him and frowned. What? Why? Northern smiled with his eyes. The fate of the continent is at stake, and right now I'm the only one with means of transportation across the continent. Doesn't it make sense that strong people come aboard and we move together to stop the damn tyrant from destroying our continent? Eli paused, staring thoughtfully at Northern. It makes perfect sense. Your words are sensible. Have you been able to discover this tyrant's location? And can we even stop him? Northern shook his head. Not at all. We're preparing to fight an origin. Eli's face went blank. His gaze became unreadable as he stared at Northern, then he yawned and turned away. Naya, let's go. I'm just going to sleep. Surely these people jest. Northern frowned. The matter deciding the fate of the continent and possibly the world at large is a jest to you? Eli's gaze darkened. He whirled around ferociously and thrust his face toward Northern, striking his chest with his finger as he made his point. No. You. Clearly you're joking. Fight an origin? Are you that gullible? Have you even seen the aftermath of one's presence? Those things have transcended what humanity can be. 100, no 1,000 times over. A zenith which we have none of, by the way, could never defeat an origin. Maybe they'd stand a chance against it. Don't you know what an origin is? That too. Chaos. Chaos is a primordial source. Its prehistoric existed even before the dawn of the first age. Arg. Help me, Fock, I'm getting a headache. He massaged his temples for a moment and raised his gaze back to Northern. Look, defeating an origin is impossible. I don't care how strong you are. We cannot defeat an origin. You don't understand, Sage Rian. These things don't fight the way we fight. Your talents could turn out to merely be drawing from their core as its source. That's how dangerous these things are. They can do anything. Rules, laws, concepts, none of these apply to them. Northern stared at him, his expression full of silent disdain. But he said nothing. Then he looked at the paragon and spoke in a calm, low tone. I have a request. Eli looked at Northern with doubt and confusion. A request? All right, as long as it's reasonable. Northern breathed gently, and the wind around them responded, blowing calmly before settling to the ground. Fight me. Eli frowned. Huh? Northern continued. If I win, you'll shut up and come with me. If I lose, he grinned. Well, I can't lose. Eli's expression darkened considerably. Naya gritted her teeth, clenched her sword, and stepped forward, but Eli raised a hand, stopping her mid-stride. Sage Rian. I don't need to remind you that you are a sage. A young one at that. He spoke, deliberately spacing each word. You are very talented. I've never seen anyone with such an imposing presence as yours. Because I'm a paragon, I can sense that you've discovered will to a certain extent, which is an impossible feat. Unless one is a paragon, doing it as a sage is insane and reckless. That alone places you on a pedestal that makes me extremely cautious of you. But in the end, you are a sage. And I am a paragon. Don't you understand that? I don't take you for a pompous young man, but I think your recent achievements might have gone to your head. Northern sighed. You've dispensed enough fatherly advice for a lifetime on what should be a simple yes or no question. Will you or will you not? Eli forced out a grin that refused to reach his eyes, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. You are one provocative young man. I'm simply going to refuse you, all right? Then you're agreeing to come with me? The veins multiplied, throbbing at 2 different spots. I see. It seems it's necessary that I teach you a lesson or two and send you on your way to your death since you insist. A matte obsidian rod materialized in his hand. He swung it across his side, spinning it through the air with practiced precision. Then he faced Northern, the rod positioned behind his back, anchored by one hand. Don't worry. I'll make this quick. Northern smiled and mirrored the gesture, the illusioned hefter slowly materializing in his hands. That's right. I haven't checked my rewards in a while. And I've been fighting quite a lot. I'm pretty sure I killed several monsters as Burning Storm and Titan's Reckoning. I should check those after getting this guy on board and extracting all the information I need from him. Chapter 1046. Brief Battle, Part 1. Northern and Eli stood 10 meters apart from each other. Everyone who had gathered around them had withdrawn even further away. Both stared each other down. Eli gripped the matte black staff while Northern lowered the illusioned hefter to the ground as if the sword meant nothing. Behind them, their spectators watched with rapt attention. Naya burned with fury. To her, this was sheer madness. A sage against a paragon, and not some watered-down paragon like the new ones. Eli had been a paragon for the past 5 years. He had grown tremendously and couldn't be ignored by nations. His talent was lethal beyond measure. The thought that he would be tested by a mere sage made her blood boil. Even she wouldn't dare. TCH. I await his crushing defeat. Perhaps after the headmaster finishes with him I'll add a lesson or two. Celis glanced at her with a stunned, guarded expression. She stared back. What's wrong, dear sister? Celis shifted her gaze away and shook her head with a strained chuckle. Nothing. Celis wasn't sure either. She doubted he could defeat their headmaster. Sure, she had seen him defeat a Leviathan. Because of that, she believed her headmaster could also fight and defeat a Leviathan. Though uncertain and confused, she refused to disrespect her headmaster by thinking he would lose to a sage. At the same time, she had seen what Northern could do. She had watched Naya fight for years. Naya didn't even come close. And Naya was an ascendant. As if that wasn't enough, strange people surrounded Northern. The white-haired man who smiled wickedly most of the time made her skin crawl. Staring at him felt deeply unsettling. There were monsters absent from here right now. Every time only one of them was sent into the pit of monsters terrorizing the nations, and it rarely took 30 minutes for the storm to be completely wiped out. This showed their true strength. And all of them bowed to Northern. The boy was far greater than she had imagined. He was like a walking nation. Nothing could contain him, nothing could touch him, nothing could own him. In fact, she now saw their attempt to recruit him into their citadel for what it truly was. No one recruited this kind of walking disaster into their citadel. Even the idea itself now sounded childish and ridiculous. Yet her mind struggled to believe that Northern could defeat the headmaster. Because she also knew the headmaster was strong. And no one, absolutely no one, had ever witnessed the peak of his strength. No one had seen him break a sweat. So, this battle would be more valuable than watching anything else anywhere else. She felt wildly lucky to be here at this moment. Raven stared with sharp focus. Helena stood behind her, arms folded. Who do you think will win? Raven glanced back slightly over her shoulder, then returned her gaze to the two combatants standing apart. She paused for a moment. I saw Northern battle a luminary and nearly slaughter him in a way that defied all reason. Something I don't think I could achieve. It shames me as a paragon to realize he's only a sage. And I'm confident I could hold my ground against this man. Helena frowned in confusion. Do you always have to circle around everything instead of just answering? However, experience plays a large role. He looks very experienced. Much will depend on how he uses that experience. But I think he'll lose because he's underestimating someone stronger than him. Helena chuckled. I see Northern has won you over. She turned back with a puzzled expression. What do you mean? Helena grinned wickedly. Never mind. Naya overheard their conversation and simply scoffed. They don't even know my headmaster. The wind whipped violently around the two main stars of this show. Eli's black staff stood on the ground beside him. He gripped it somewhere around the middle. The staff looked sleek and plain. Until Eli moved. Eli's movement was insane. His speed was ruthless and unfair to anyone with a speed-type talent. He flashed forward before the wind could even flow in his path. The explosive speed shocked everyone into gasps. Of course, Byran simply kept his wicked grin. Jessi and Linus remained unmoved. Everyone's expressions lasted less than a heartbeat. The two collided and the entire landscape shook violently. A shockwave exploded outward in a circle, then another ring of dust and debris rolled away from the impact. They all turned and shielded their eyes from the center of the battlefield. Eli was certain that, with his crushing speed, he had ended the battle before it began. However, the small smirk on his face slowly crumpled, replaced by a tight frown. Standing in place with his sword easily arced over his head, blocking the strike Eli had brought down. And looking completely unbothered. That's it? Northern swung his sword to the side as though swatting away a fly. The movement of his hand was so casual. However, Eli felt himself fighting against tremendous force that sent him flying sideways. He sailed through the air, unable to control his own momentum until his feet hit the ground and he used the friction of earth and rubble to skid to a halt. He lowered his head for a moment, his expression filled with disbelief. What? He couldn't believe it at all. What's happening? How is that the strength of a sage? It made no sense. No reasonable sense. Could he be pretending to be a sage? Eli narrowed his eyes and peered even deeper into Northern's soul. There was nothing there, nothing at all. But the presence was that of a sage. He wasn't mistaken about that. He would admit he hadn't been trying, so maybe the boy was extraordinary enough to block his strike, but that effortless sweep just now. A paragon can crush any force from any rank of drifters lower than them instantly. Because they were overwhelmingly powerful and deeply attuned to the world's workings, the world actually listened to them. Things like force and momentum could be commanded in a certain way. But just now all of that was useless. Eli felt like he'd been struck by something far stronger than himself. And it was, he frowned darkly. Impossible. Chapter 1047. Brief Battle, Part 2. Eli stood gripping his staff with deceptive casualness. He studied the acclaimed sage emotions warring across his features like storm clouds. Was he truly a sage? Was he lying? A paragon in disguise? How could he read the speed of that attack? How did he deflect a paragon's power so effortlessly? A sage? A sage? Questions cascaded through his mind like an avalanche. He was devastatingly confused. Northern lowered his sword until the tip nearly kissed the ground. So, my turn? Eli's eyes narrowed to slits as he braced himself. Of course he didn't know that nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare him for what was about to unfold. Northern drew a deep breath, then exhaled, and vanished. Literally. Naya's eyes went wide as saucers. What try? Before her thoughts could form, another impact thundered across the battlefield. She couldn't grasp what had transpired. Everything had moved faster than her eyes could track. But the impact was devastating. It shattered the ground and launched stone fragments skyward like deadly confetti. The first shockwave rippled outward, violently displacing everything in its path. Even the airship behind them shuddered, something that hadn't happened when Eli's attack landed. Dust and debris shrouded the battlefield's center, concealing the outcome from all eyes. Naya's hands clenched into fists, barely restraining herself from plunging into that storm of dust. Worry gnawed at her because of the massive shockwave, her brow creasing with confusion and skepticism. Yet she remained defiantly confident in her headmaster's inevitable victory. Until the obscurity cleared, and they all could see. Her face twisted in denial. What? Her eyes trembled like leaves in a hurricane. That sea. Cannot be. The others merely exhaled, as though they'd been holding their breath for the expected result. Celis appeared stunned as well, but not devastated like Naya. Where Naya felt terror, Celis felt awe. I guess. He really can defeat a paragon. At the battlefield's heart, Eli had collapsed to one knee. His staff lay nowhere in sight, and Northern's blade hovered at his throat, the steel nearly touching his Adam's apple. He swallowed hard, staring at Northern with raw disbelief etched in every line of his face. What? Do you want a rematch? Eli sighed and shook his head, a rueful smile ghosting across his lips. No. I admit defeat, complete and utter defeat. I underestimated you gravely. Even when I thought I could measure your strength, I was still blind. Northern scoffed. Whatever you're thinking right now after witnessing this is probably still you being blind. He released the illusioned hefter and extended a helping hand to Eli. Welcome aboard. Eli stared at the offered hand for a heartbeat, then grasped it and allowed Northern to pull him upright. Don't feel bad. I'm a cheater. It was only natural that I'd defeat you. By then Naya had stormed over. Her eyes blazed with fury as she glared at Northern. You cutthroat. You cheated. I knew it. You could never defeat the headmaster fairly. Naya. Stop. You're only embarrassing me. Eli's stern warning cut through her tirade like a blade. She immediately fell silent, shrinking like a scolded puppy. Her head dropped and she bowed slightly. I apologized to the headmaster. Eli regarded her with a gentle smile, sighed, then slipped his hands into his robes. Please, Sage Rian, lead the way. Northern guided them toward the airship. The group walked together, Northern and Eli trailing at the rear. As they approached the ship's stairs, Eli's gaze swept over the vessel's intricate alien design. What is this? It doesn't look like it was forged here. Northern answered with casual indifference. Yeah, some unique builder crafted it, probably a tyrant himself or someone who served one closely. Later the Origins reshaped it into a prison, then Chaos Prince added his own touches to make it home. That's pretty much the story. Eli stopped dead, forcing Northern, who was already climbing, to halt and glance back. What? Eli's frame trembled slightly. So, Sage Rian, I don't understand. Why am I coming with you? Northern's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Having a paragon on the team would be a tremendous asset to the crew. Eli forced out a weak chuckle. I see. Northern's frown deepened like a chasm. Why the question? Don't tell me you want to break your word now? It's not that. It's just that I think I'm having a crisis of confidence right now. I'm not sure I deserve a place here. I'm a paragon, yet I've never even glimpsed the stool the Chaos Prince sat on, let alone owned his former airship. Northern's expression softened into a smile. Oh, that's it? Don't worry about it, at least you know who Chaos Prince is. Let's go. Eli climbed the stairs, and when he finally reached the deck, his face drained of all color. His expression turned rigid as marble and his hands flew open, white sparks crackling around his fingers like miniature lightning. Northern sensed the shift in atmosphere and quickly raised a cautioning hand. Please, you don't need to do that. They're all my subordinates. Eli halted the summoning and straightened his spine. His gaze darted between Northern and the creatures looming behind him, bewilderment washing over his features like a tide. A humanoid monster with onyx skin and ivory lines etched across his body stood at one point gripping a staff crowned with a crescent moon. His presence radiated power like heat from a forge. Another, obsidian-skinned and leaner than the first, commanded the deck's far end. His eyes were sharp as razors and narrow as slits, sending ice-cold tendrils crawling up Eli's spine. Sweat rolled beneath his robes. There was a smaller horned creature, a knighted figure draped in a flowing white cloak, and even a massive white wolf lounging somewhere in the background. Yet none of them unnerved him like these two titans. Even though Northern had asked him to relax, Eli found it impossible. How could anyone expect calm in the face of such ferociously powerful monsters? The very suggestion was outrageous. Every instinct screamed at him to flee this cursed vessel immediately. He turned to Northern, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "Sage Rian? Really? Who in the world are you?" Chapter 1048. Standards of an Apprentice. Afterwards the tower soared towards the western wing en route to Drywall. The morning had fully penetrated the sky and snow was falling from the clouds, drifting softly onto the floors and roofs of the airship. There were still a large number of people, even though many had been dropped off along the way. Elina stood at the left edge of the deck, gazing at the sky with her hand slightly outstretched. She lowered her gaze and watched as a snowflake gently settled on her small but calloused palm. So much had happened in one life, and in such a short time. It seemed the world gave her no time to breathe between the torrent of shocks she kept receiving. She stood there staring at the flakes on her palm, her eyes fixated on them but her mind elsewhere. In the blink of an eye, the entire academy had crumbled to dust. Everything had happened before she could even grasp what was unfolding. She had lost many comrades, several students, but many more had also been rescued. By the one person she least expected. Rian was a student they all presumed weak. He was in the non-combative school. Why else would he be there if not because he didn't fit into the combative school? He might have been skilled at one or two things and certainly physically capable, but at the end of the day, he lacked a talent well suited for battle, or so Elina and several other forge masters had believed. But he had proven himself an exceptional blacksmith. Most of them in the forge couldn't stop gawking, couldn't stop marveling at how magnificent and flawless his forgery was. He knew how to read a resource and determine the optimal way to utilize such minerals. He could examine steel and commune with it in ways that only ancient forgers ever could. Being able to discover the essence of a resource was something lost to the ages. The forgers of this era had long settled for mediocrity. Of course, in special places there were exceptional crafters, but they were rarer than the norm and were typically restricted to a clan or nation. Unlike the academy forgers, who generally accepted jobs throughout the continent and delivered, those craftsmen were confined and probably never renowned. This was why among everyone Rian was considered a prodigious forger who would usher in a new era for the academy's smiths. Of course, right now that same academy was gone and none of those accolades mattered anymore. But still he was already extraordinary. Rian was. Who would have ever imagined in their wildest dreams that he was a formidable warrior? A sage no less? He commanded an airship of his own and had assembled a crew so powerful that one person could shift the tide of battle, not to mention himself. Elina hadn't witnessed the battle with the Leviathan clearly, but on the ship the students who had seen it wouldn't stop talking about it. The student councils were silenced by his might and presence. They were the academy's elite, yet they claimed they had never witnessed anything like it in their lives. The surviving instructors spoke of it, saying they would never stand a chance. Before long they were comparing him to legendary figures. How do you think he would fare against the Tomb Riders? To be honest, I can't say. I've never heard of a sage defeating a Leviathan. It's almost absurd. I doubt I would ever believe such a tale if I hadn't seen it myself. The instructors spoke with such terror and awe that it was slowly drifting toward reverence. All the same, this was Rian, whom she knew, who had been her student. It was so difficult for Elina to believe. "Are you okay, master?" Elina frowned, nearly shivering as she heard the familiar hoarse voice. She glanced sideways as Northern joined her at the ship's edge where she stood. Then she quickly turned forward, trying not to look at his face. Somehow she felt so awkward, so ashamed of the moments she had commanded him around and acted like she was shit without ever considering that the tables could turn on her. Who would have known that he had always been this strong, this powerful, this important? Now she couldn't help but feel embarrassed and disappointed in herself. "The past few days have been overwhelming for me. I should have come to see you sooner." Elina tensed at his words. She nearly stumbled over her first word before it left her mouth, but she held her peace for a moment, breathed steadily, and spoke. "Why? You didn't need to." Northern looked at her with a strange kind of compassion. "You are my master. My growth as a blacksmith is owed greatly to you. It's only natural that I treat you with respect. Are you refusing that?" "Refusing me?" Elina only felt more confused. His words sounded so wrong, so strange, so unexpected. He was a sage, one who could determine the fate of nations. At least she had watched him do so these past 3 days. How could he be saying all these things treating her with respect? All she had done was teach him blacksmithing, and moreover she wasn't exceptional. She wasn't important. Why was he speaking to her like he cared? What was happening? She sighed deeply. You are an incredibly strong person, someone who carries the burden of the continent's fate. Whether this continent will still exist next year, which begins tomorrow by the way, I believe will be largely determined by your actions. What we share is too small and insignificant compared to the magnitude of what lies ahead of you. I think it's only natural that you focus on that. Elena looked at him with slightly widened eyes. She expected this to be common sense and was bewildered that it wasn't to him. Northern looked down for a moment. While you make sense, I also don't think that should be any excuse for anyone to abandon people who have taught them greatly and contributed to their growth. Elena suddenly felt exhausted. He's stubborn. Chapter 1049. Uncertainty of the future. After speaking to Elena for a couple of minutes, Northern retreated to the limitless void. He settled onto the dais that led to the opulent throne. The power of the black flames blazing across the platform had diminished tremendously. Several patches had died completely, and Northern couldn't entirely figure out why. He'd been mulling it over and suspected it had to do with his irregular use of chaos and void, or perhaps because Omniform was now penetrating the depths of his soul. After all, the seed of void which chaos had tried to invade was hijacked by Omniform and unwritten, then transformed into the seed of endless. That was merely the beginning of the changes ravaging his soul. Whatever had transpired there opened the floodgates for unwritten and Omniform to breach the core of his being, and the corruption was beginning to manifest in the limitless void. Northern surveyed his domain. The dying flames were just one symptom. The enormous columns that spiraled upward and stretched endlessly were weathering as though they'd stood here for millennia, when before they gleamed with sinister radiance, amplifying the ominous ambience of the Void Palace. Even the ceiling's beautiful luminescence was dimming. The Void Palace now looked as though it had seen better days. His expression grew despondent. The Void Palace and limitless void held deep meaning for him. He refused to lose it. But whatever was consuming chaos and void was poisoning the limitless void. Everything was crumbling and the decay cut deep. Still, Northern had made his choice. He would depend less and less on these powers. He didn't know how that decision would help him escape whatever webcall had spun around him, but Northern was certain it would work. Because even now resisting chaos and void felt like battling an addiction. Right now he was experiencing withdrawal symptoms. He ached to plunge into that battle below, summon a field of black lances and slice through everything before his enemies realized they were already cut. Or unleash those vicious arrows of true chaos. His fingertips tingled with such desperate urge that he had to wrench his thoughts away to find any semblance of peace. The exterior of the Void Palace was in even worse condition. Monsters rampaged constantly, though Northern had 3 allies helping him. Even the Blood King wasn't safe outside anymore. Which made perfect sense. Northern had acquired him from a chaos-infested rift. Before he'd planned to hunt the rest, he was grateful he'd never found the time. Because chaos would have wielded more weapons against him. Void was passive and calm, yet dangerous nonetheless. The silent threat was far more perilous than the one that broadcast its destructive intent. Void was a pretender. A devastating element of utter emptiness masquerading as his ally. Thank goodness I have those to depend on. Linus' 2 sidekicks and Alan typically moved to control and subdue any soul rampaging across the limitless void, usually with assistance from the non-rampaging souls. But this had slashed their productivity on the new dungeon. Not that the progress had been impressive to begin with. Mining the stones proved grueling, but the souls persevered. Both of Northern's clones, meant to serve as essence reserves, also labored tirelessly, though lately they'd been forced to vanish, frequently hampering progress further. The 3 could accomplish only so much. But that was acceptable. He was even contemplating shutting down the operation entirely to avoid squandering resources. He'd already increased the mining quotas and programmed his clone with Hao's necessary instructions. Currently Hao occupied a skeletal section of the limitless void alongside the 13,000 people Northern had rescued from Lithia. Honestly, Northern had nearly forgotten about them. Which was one reason he was heading to Drywall. He'd considered releasing them here in the tower, but presumed it would shock everyone. So instead he would wait until they reached Drywall, then use his clone with Hao to establish a gateway to Verilania where people could relocate. Right now acting felt rash given the limitless void's instability and his current airborne status. What he wanted to do now was connect a rift to physical storage. Hao maintained one in a city called Gafaso H. It was an underground storage unit. How did Northern know? He simply absorbed everything his clone experienced. He only missed things Hao kept from the clones or events he wasn't monitoring when they occurred. Over time, even during his academy leisure hours, he'd let his mind wander elsewhere, which for him meant observing Elliot's activities. Northern closed his eyes momentarily and transmitted the command. A rift would manifest in the underground facility and resource transfer would begin immediately. He refused to let the Kirathon's bones go to waste. He still intended to forge them into a devastatingly powerful weapon. But right now he lacked the luxury of preserving them. The underground storage wouldn't suffice and the bones stubbornly refused to disassemble. The minerals took priority, so Northern reluctantly had to choose. After sorting out that crisis, he wanted to address himself. First, Northern realized it had been far too long since he'd examined his profile and tallied his talent fragments. He needed to see exactly what was happening to him. The changes ravaging his soul, the new seed, everything else, including his recent acquisitions. He wanted to see it all. Northern smiled as he summoned his profile. Profile. Name. Rian Artemis Riem Guard. Northern Long Guard. True name. Unwritten. The Titan's Reckoning. Burning Storm. Attributes. Omniform. Limitless Yenoid. Vestige of Euroheos. Chaos Eyes. Euroheotic Regeneration. Euroheos Flame. Seed of Endless. Euroheos Infusion. Euroheotic Resonance. Euroheos and Yen 0 ID. Soul Rank. Transient. Yenoid Summons. 12/100. Talent Fragments. 165/6000. Copied Talents. 6 out of 6. Own Talents. 4. Attribute Abilities. Active/passive. October 11th. Owned Items. Molten Vein. Illusioned Hefter. Moonlit Scale and 20 others. Northern leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He didn't need an explanation to understand what was happening. Every rune describing chaos and void was becoming vague and twisted, somehow representing their deteriorating state. Is this a good thing? Even he wasn't sure. He was deeply troubled by whatever was transpiring within his soul. He exhaled and pressed his hand to his chest. He could feel it. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Not knowing what might happen left him at a severe disadvantage. The last thing he wanted was to become a catalyst that would accelerate or ensure the Central Plains' destruction. He stared at his hands and clenched them, his azure eyes blazing with resolve. No. I'd rather kill myself than serve those bastards. Chapter 1050. Rematch, Part 1. Approaching Drywall. Northern's eyes sharpened as Drywall sprawled into view. It was expansive and dark. Dark. It had taken a few hours to cross the whole of Welster and finally reach Drywall, so it was now late morning. The day star blazed radiant and brilliant, shimmering against the cold air. The problem was the closer the tower drifted toward South Drywall, the darker it became. Northern stood somewhere in the middle of the encroaching darkness, frowning as he stared into the void. The crews were rattled and confused. What's happening? Night during the day? They looked back, but the day remained bright. Only as the ship drifted further did the night thicken around them. Such a phenomenon was nearly impossible. It had never been witnessed before. Or so they thought, until Ascendant Zion stepped forward hurriedly. He reached Northern with a knowing expression etched across his face. Northern met his gaze calmly. He had already figured it out before Ascendant Zion approached. After all, he had unfinished business with that damned monster. To think the bastard would last this long. I'm flattered. The Shadow Storm now officially claimed third position among the monsters that had cost him dearly. He never expected it. Northern strode toward the bow and leaped gracefully, floating like a leaf on the wind. He landed on the rim and looked back at the crew. Nebulous Lord watched him with compassionate eyes, while Abyss Tyrant remained indifferent. Let me handle this one. It's personal. He waved and fell carelessly. Eli watched. The moment Northern fell, he almost cried out in concern, but held back when he saw that even Northern's closest subordinates remained silent. Meanwhile, Northern's body plummeted through the dark clouds. He closed his eyes, crossed his hands behind his head, and placed one leg over the other as though he were lounging on a plush bed savoring sleep. He ignored the violent torrent his body tore through as it hurtled toward the ground. His fall accelerated relentlessly. 30 feet to impact, to crash into paste. Northern didn't react. 20 feet. Still no reaction. 10, nothing. Then suddenly his body twisted and his feet touched the ground softly, as though he hadn't just been plummeting at terrifying speed. The way his momentum simply vanished defied all logic. The moment he landed, uneasiness washed over him. Something about this darkness felt terribly familiar yet wrong. Northern scowled at the shadows and began summoning the molten vein. Black sparks danced across his body, coalescing into jagged dark armor with overlapping plates that fit together perfectly like the scales of a vicious apex predator. Finally, the helmet formed, leaving only the shaped visor opening. Northern's eyes gleamed with cold blue light from within. So, do you remember? He opened one hand. Balls of fire the size of buildings spawned instantly in the air, 1, 2, 3, until 17 hung suspended above him. They cast a fiery glow around Northern's position, temporarily banishing the darkness. He could see he stood on solid ground. This was different from his last encounter with the shadow monster. The bastard has grown stronger. Most likely evolved? Wasn't it already Apex though? Northern was puzzled. The monster had been an Apex maelstrom. But now it felt entirely different. Why? Monsters weren't supposed to evolve beyond their rank. Nebulous Lord and Abyss Tyrant were different scenarios, they were being influenced by Omniform. But this bastard has been to my soul too. The light in Northern's eyes sharpened, growing more dangerous. It couldn't be. The chances were slim and it was an outrageous idea. But that was the only explanation for the difference and the uneasiness Northern felt. He finally decided to peer into the monster's soul. However, nothing came. Northern turned right and glared into the darkness. Nothing. He stared left, the same void. Things are getting dire. Two possibilities existed. He could no longer see souls. Northern didn't believe chaos had collapsed to that extent, so he dismissed that theory. However, there was a second reason gnawing at him. Northern looked around, his helmet folding and vanishing into fragments of light. His expression grew pale despite the uneasy frown creasing his features. He extended his hand and swept it lightly through the space. What the hell? It really is darkness. That had to be it. Currently he stood not within a monster's soul but in pure absolute darkness. How can that creature create darkness within light? Did it truly evolve? The answer was stark and undeniable. Creating darkness was something the shadow in Thrall couldn't do before. Yet suddenly now it could. The damned abomination had definitely evolved. Northern was certain. What baffled him about its evolution was this nagging suspicion. When the monster invaded his soul, it might have been tainted by the influence of void chaos and omniform, which made its evolution possible. Either way, the only method to confirm this was to find the real shadow in Thrall and examine it directly. That would also verify his initial suspicion. For clones materialized, each sprinting in different directions, all transforming into streaks of light that blazed away with ferocious speed. Northern stood alone. He closed his eyes momentarily and used his spatial awareness to read his surroundings, widening the scope both below and above. After a while, he was certain of what was happening. There's shelter underground, and survivors to the east. His eyes widened a bit and then he smiled. Interesting. He slowly lifted off the ground. His helmet reappeared and sealed shut, then he rocketed eastward, slicing through the wind at breakneck speed. Despite the fact that the entire city of South Drywall had been devoured by darkness, Tharion's citadel building still stood strong and vibrant. A transparent shield with bronze accents shimmered over the entire structure. The shield's shape resembled a colossal gourd half buried in the ground. Countless monsters and drifters enthralled by the darkness relentlessly hammered the barrier, but their efforts proved futile. Nothing they did could make the shield budge. On the citadel's balcony, the one that jutted out overlooking the compound, Elitis and Gurdon stood watching the horde as they desperately tried to tear down the shield. Elitis raised his eyes to the distance and spotted something. A small speck of blue light racing closer. He adjusted his monocle and smiled, pleasantly prompting Gurdon to ask, "You're grinning? In this situation?" Elitis's smile didn't waver. "It seems we're in luck today." Chapter 1051. Lucky Day. Everything was supposed to go smoothly. Everything had been meticulously planned, even though they had to fight this battle impromptu with no understanding of their enemy and insufficient time for preparation. But still, the battle had been progressing well. For the most part, they were winning. It was just one catastrophe they couldn't overcome: the crawling darkness. Initially, they utilized the city wall's defenses. The defense cast a shield of light over the city, making it nearly impossible for anything with an elemental body to enter. Darkness, fire, light, nothing of that caliber could penetrate, so the darkness remained trapped. During this respite, Gurdon was dispatched to the wall to find a way to combat the writhing darkness, but even that proved futile. Eventually, the drifters on the wall had to evacuate and retreat deeper into the city. Meanwhile, Gurdon alone defended the entire wall. No monster drifter, enthralled or otherwise, could breach his position. He was like a divine force of judgment. His gourd and red thread formed a lethal weapon combination. The threads moved erratically at breakneck speed, severing monsters in twain within the blink of an eye. The gourd served as a vessel for different kinds of mist. When the drifters retreated, he filled the wall with crimson mist. As monsters entered the fog, they became enraged and charged at him with ferocity, intent on slaughtering and destroying everything in their path. For a brief while they lost their sensibility. They lost coordination and fell into patterns of recklessness, making it easier for Gurdon to slay them with his thread. He moved fluidly from place to place, almost as if he were everywhere at once. He flowed like the threads themselves, and his melee attacks were ferocious and terrifying. Once he landed a devastating punch into the ribs of a creature that resembled an overgrown mound of rotting flesh with 2 human legs. The monster's side snapped, air exploded outward, and multiple ribs burst through the other side before the beast went reeling through the air. Another time he simply kicked the head clean off another abomination. While it would have been logical for the elites to join him, none could. No one could fight alongside Gurdon when he was truly serious about combat. They were bound to die. Maybe not immediately but inevitably. The mist in his gourds was as lethal to drifters as it was to monsters. Because of this, Gurdon preferred to fight alone. As the drifters retreated into the city, the mist also retreated into the gourd and another was released. This was a purple mist that filled the air with poison. Most monsters crawling toward the wall collapsed before they could even reach the peak. Those strong enough to resist the lethal poison were falling before his fists. The monsters were being annihilated at an alarming rate. However, the tide of battle shifted when the crawling darkness resumed its advance. It simply shattered the shield and began seeping into the city. Gurdon found himself engulfed in darkness and was attacked by a creature with 7 heads. He held his own against the beast and nearly killed it, until another 7-headed creature attacked him. The creature was somehow capable of cloning itself. The flow of battle shifted and Gurdon had to retreat. He solidified a protective mist over the entire citadel building, while they patiently devised a way to deal with the darkness without losing too many soldiers. That was how they remained until now, with no clear path forward. At the very least, their numbers had been drastically reduced because Alistran and some newcomer had been busy setting maze traps in place. Gurdon also suspected that those traps had somehow kept the monster from attacking them. It made no sense that the creature hadn't assaulted the only settlement still standing in the darkness for 2 days. That was when he noticed Elidas smile. Things were dire. Even he, who often considered laughter a form of expression, found it difficult to laugh these days. If they weren't careful, all of them would be annihilated. It was terrifying, as if all of them were simply waiting for the day they would die, which was only a matter of time. The creature that had attacked him just needed to arrive. Then Elidas said, "It seems we're in luck today." The statement intrigued Gurdon so much that he almost smiled. However, a thunderous clash killed his expression. Front! He leaned against the balcony railing and focused. For a moment the entire area was shrouded in dust, making it impossible to see what was happening. But he could make out something. A white-haired boy moving with lightning speed through the mist. The movement, which he as an ascendant struggled to track, was everywhere at once. The figure was effortlessly snapping monsters and breaking them apart with his bare hands. His hands moved like blades, his body flowing with devastating momentum. He controlled force and impact as if they were his own creation. Blood arced through the air, but he paid it no mind. He plunged bare hands into monsters' throats and ripped them out, only to discard the gore with an irritated expression. Gurdon trembled, feeling cold in his bones as he watched. The speed was mesmerizing. He had to enter a trance-like state just to barely keep up. He couldn't think of anything else or dare look away for even a second. He was completely awestruck, enthralled by such an existence, until people finally began reaching the balcony and fleeing the compound, terrified by whatever carnage was unfolding outside. The ferocious battle ended as abruptly as it began, short but brutal. A boy stood before the gate, shaking blood from his hands, his expression one of pure disgust as he stared down at the final monster he choked to death and torn apart. Thalen stood at the balcony, staring down with a slight frown. He recognized the figure but harbored suspicions, until Elidas spoke. "You need not doubt what you're seeing. It is indeed the Void Lord." Northern looked up at Thalen on the balcony and waved with a broad smile. Chapter 1052. Strongest Sage is merely a boy, and now everybody is angry. Sage Rian. Thalen stared at Northern, amazed and stunned. "You look so different. Even your presence." So many things had changed about the boy since their last meeting. Northern was a sage just as he was. They were of the same soul rank, and yet Northern felt so much stronger, so different. Of course, being a sage was just one of the many things that defined Thalen. He was also an elf, probably privy to devastating battle methods and strange spell arts. No one had seen him fight to tell. Even knowing all this, he still felt so inferior, so small compared to Northern in a very pronounced way. If he were being brutally honest, Northern's presence threatened to terrify him. Northern meanwhile smiled. "It's nice to meet you again, Headmaster. You look quite the same. Are you sure you've been eating well?" Thalen looked at Northern and exhaled with a smile. "For a moment I thought your presence alone would rip out my throat, but surprisingly you're still him." Northern frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thalen patted Northern's hair and ruffled it. "How have you been?" Northern thought for a moment before responding. "For the most part, stressed." "I'm sure you know what's going on?" Thalen looked at him, his expression growing grave. Then he surveyed the darkness that had consumed the city. "How could we not? Come, let's go inside." People flanked their left and right, all staring strangely as the headmaster himself escorted this powerful and menacing stranger into the Citadel Hall. Elidas was waiting at the entrance. As Northern approached, he bowed 90 degrees. "My lord." Northern smiled weakly, somewhat embarrassed because people were watching. He scratched his hair. Yeah, I see you did the job well. Well done. I hope you've been good?" Elidas nodded, his gaze dutifully stern. "Yes, my lord, I have been. Thank you for the opportunity to serve you." I swear whatever Revant did to this guy I'll have to find out. Northern sighed as they walked inside. Meanwhile Thalen pulled him closer by the shoulder and whispered, "You have a lot to tell me, buddy." Northern was silent for barely a moment. Right? They entered the building's hall. The place was packed. Drifters bustled about different tasks. Some were chatting, some were receiving treatment, some were preparing intensely for something, others were sleeping on couches and floors. They all greeted and bowed to the headmaster as he passed. They crossed the hall, entered the elevator chamber, and were taken to the upper floor. The chamber opened, revealing an even more expansive hall than the one on the first floor. There were sophisticated sofas, chairs, and beds. The place looked somewhat disheveled, as though everything had been arranged hastily. Several people hung around, though not many. A black-haired girl sat silently on the sofa, legs crossed. Beside her was another girl in an orange bodysuit. A radiant boy with colorful glasses slumped on the same sofa's left end. A silver-haired guy leaned against the wall. Beside him stood a boy with a strange hair color combination of black and white. They all stood scattered around, staring at him as Thalen led him inside. He looked around. "I don't see Ryan?" "Oh, Ryan. He's currently assisting one of the elites. They're fighting off something different." Northern looked at him curiously. "Something different?" Thalen touched his shoulder and led him forward. "I'll fill you in later. For now there are more pressing matters." He looked at the people in the hall. "These are the elites of Therian Citadel." He began introducing them all to Northern, and when he was done he looked at everyone and said, "Everyone, this is Rian, the talent of the continent, and permit me to say, perhaps the strongest sage who has ever existed." They all began frowning in different ways. Sale stepped forward. "You do realize, Headmaster, that's quite a bold statement." He scrutinized Northern carefully. "I heard briefly about him last week. Heard he was a student. Even if he happens to be a sage, which is questionable, I don't think calling him the strongest is reasonable." Thalen smiled and looked at Sale. "Sir Sale, I understand where you're coming from. It's blasphemous to people like us who have spent decades as sages honing our powers. But I also have my reasons for saying what I said. And not to mention the validity of my statement is based on the last time I knew him. Since then 4 months have passed. I don't know him anymore." He glanced at Elitis. "But it would be foolish of me to assume he'd remain the same." Zeke sat upright and turned back, leaning against the sofa's headrest. "Headmaster, aren't you hyping this guy too much? We're your elites right here, and yet you don't give us nearly as much hype. Watching you vouch so hard for him is heartbreaking, I'm not gonna lie." Thalen wanted to speak but hesitated. Northern smiled pleasantly, making them all frown. A boy with spiky red hair, Rex, glared and marched forward. "What's funny, bozo?" Northern didn't particularly pay attention to him. He was still smiling. "I found the bastard's main body. Interesting. You guys did quite a number on it." Almost instantly Northern frowned. "What? There's more than one body?" Northern slowly raised his head toward the man who had reached him without many people in the hall noticing. The guy's hair obscured his eyes, making his expression completely unreadable. As Northern's gaze met the man's face, a wide grin split across it. "Did you say you found the main body?" Northern frowned arrogantly. "Yes, I did." Gordon raised his chin, grinning even wider. "Oh, nice. You want to fight it?" Northern's expression remained impassive. "I'm already fighting it." Everyone in the room suddenly turned. The air shifted. They stared cautiously, some with subtle indignation, others with curiosity and interest. "Before coming here I sent my clones to search for it. Currently there are 3 main bodies. I'll have my clones deal with all 3. There's no need for me to get involved." Gordon's expression went blank for several seconds. Then he suddenly burst into laughter. He laughed for a while before stopping. From his hair an amber glow pierced through. He grinned and slapped Northern's shoulder playfully. "Ahahahaha. I like this one." Chapter 1053. Rematch, Part 2. This is rather an interesting turn of events. Northern, or to be precise Burning Storm, stood trapped within a labyrinthine maze of buildings. The structures had shifted and rearranged themselves, forming a bizarre architectural prison that ensnared the shadow in Thrall's massive form. This wasn't an isolated occurrence. Throughout the city the same phenomenon had taken hold. The entire metropolis had transformed into some kind of colossal maze board. Even reaching this point he'd been forced to cut through several monsters trapped within the shifting corridors. Now he'd finally reached the shadow in Thrall, which was using brute force to tear through the building walls. However, as it demolished each barrier, the structures rearranged themselves, seamlessly filling the gaps where walls had been destroyed. The cycle seemed endless. But this prison could only hold for so long. Eventually the city would exhaust its supply of buildings. In fact, Burning Storm suspected it was already happening. Earlier, when he'd passed through a barren section of the city, he'd almost thought no buildings remained at all. Apparently nearly every structure had been mobilized to barricade monsters and separate them from each other. Whoever built this city must have been a genius. But what intrigued him even more was how they'd managed to hack into such possibilities. Well, who knows? Burning Storm's expression suddenly darkened. What? Another body? Barely a second later, Titan's Reckoning had discovered another shadow in thrall. He'd been considering recalling his clones to preserve essence. Titan's Reckoning was currently just a clone, as were the other two. One of his consciousnesses remained at Therian Citadel right now while the other was here with him. I really should try training the third. He suspected he first needed to master the demon of emulation, which he was doing. The attribute had proven instrumental in taking down Eli with a single devastating strike. All he'd had to do was peer into the true essence of Eli's fighting style and emulate it. Of course, with his superior power and physique, victory had come easily. He'd also glimpsed into a Paragon's battle methodology. As simple as battle style might appear, Northern had realized in that split moment that for a Paragon it was entirely different. It transcended mere combat technique, beginning to weave its roots into the very fabric of existence and consciousness of will. Simply put, a Paragon's battle style began to matter to the world itself. Whether it threatened reality, amused it, or affected it in some other way, Northern didn't know exactly. But he knew it carried weight. Somehow the laws and concepts of reality were conscious of it. Ruffsberg wasn't a formidable fighter, but his spellcraft was synonymous with battle art, and Northern had witnessed firsthand how profoundly it affected and rewrote reality. Of course, he could argue that Ruffsberg's case was unique because he was a spacebender. Still, Northern believed there was something more. Something he wasn't grasping yet. I was merely considering a third parallel consciousness, but now I feel like experimenting. He gazed at the seven-headed shadow in thrall with a heartfelt smile. It will serve as an excellent training partner. While I split my mind in two again. It should be easier this time since we're not together. The movements shouldn't overlap. Surprisingly, creating another flow of consciousness separate from his own proved effortless. Not only that, but the parallel mind existed perfectly independent of his original parallel mind. It was strange, sudden, and startling. The thought patterns and processing speed were also incredible. If anything was going to cause problems, Northern felt it would be his inability to keep pace with his own accelerated thinking. He looked down momentarily, wearing a stunned expression. What did I miss? Then he suddenly remembered. The battle with Ruffsberg. When his speed had increased and surpassed light speed, he recalled how his mind had struggled desperately to keep up. Demon of Change had activated in that moment, dramatically shifting and expanding his mental capacity and capability to contain and match his physical speed. That must have stretched the boundaries of his consciousness somehow, and now that he was attempting to divide himself into three parallel flows, ensuring they wouldn't clash with each other, it had suddenly become manageable. And of course there was also the fact that he was actually making them truly parallel, which he hadn't considered before. But simultaneously, Northern suspected he was wrong. One of the reasons creating a parallel thought flow was now possible was likely due to the cognitive expansion that had occurred during his fight with Ruffsberg. He laughed. Aha! I guess I received far more benefit from that battle than I actually realized. A corner of his lips curved upward again. Let's see just how far I can push this. Northern created 3 parallel thought flows, then 5. And he felt perfectly fine. Completely stable. He even sensed he could create more. The only limitation was that solely the main body could generate clones. However, he'd also conceived a way to circumvent that restriction. Now that his consciousness existed practically within a clone, wouldn't it be accurate to say Burning Storm here was the main body? But then another obvious obstacle emerged. Burning Storm couldn't create clones because Burning Storm wasn't unwritten. He could only accomplish this with the 2 unwritten clones and deploy them to this location. But those were already engaged in combat. Titan's Reckoning was already launching through the air to deliver a mountain-shattering blow into one head of the shadow in thrall. Meanwhile, the shadow in thrall before Burning Storm was slowly rotating toward him. Burning Storm grinned and waved. Hey there, buddy. We meet again. He shrugged. Well, we're probably encountering each other in 2 other locations simultaneously, which is actually fascinating. If someone mistook me for a vile monster breeder, they might assume you're my offspring. Because seriously, what's with this newfound ability to clone yourself? And you're suddenly an apex destroyer now? Really? What the hell happened to you? You got infected with a bit of omniform and suddenly you're a superstar. Chapter 1054. Rematch, Part 3. Silence stretched between them for a heartbeat. Then the Shadow Hydra unleashed a bone-chilling, ear-splitting screech that would have shattered glass for miles around. Burning Storm gazed up at the beast from below, laughing and bellowing like a madman. Yes, I know you're as thrilled to see me as I am to see you. You want to show me just how far you've come after stealing my attribute, don't you? Alright, baby boy or girl, go berserk for me. The Shadow Hydra shrieked again and plunged forward with raw might and savage fury. All 7 heads snapped viciously and sliced through the howling gale, diving toward Burning Storm. He remained motionless until the final second. Then he dissolved into a streak of cantaloupe light. like a spark from a fire fracturing and reforming somewhere in the air. A faint smile crossed his lips as he watched the creature's heads crash into the earth one after another, sending torrents of shockwaves rippling outward. Northern shut his eyes. The force of impact seeped into his veins as the shockwaves spread. He vanished and circled the shadow beast. The creature lifted its heads bewildered for a moment. When Northern finally stopped, the monster hurled its heads toward the air, where he hovered only for him to vanish again and materialize on the opposite side. Two of the beast's heads whipped toward the new direction and lunged at him. Northern simply raised his hand and summoned a momentum guard. The creature's two heads stretched endlessly and slammed against his shield of momentum, causing the air to shiver. Northern thrust his hand forward. The momentum guard surged ahead, instantly crushing the monster's heads to pulp. Purple blood sprayed through the air and rained down in putrid drops. He didn't pause. He had already vanished and in a heartbeat collided with the shadow in Thrall's main body. A fierce and devastating shockwave tore across the land, cracked the ground, and triggered an earthquake. The earth seemed compressed by force, unable to shatter yet unable to hold. This lasted only a fraction of a second before the moment broke free from time's frozen grip. The shadow in Thrall's body rocketed away at tremendous speed, tumbling and smashing through the ground. Building walls crumbled as the body's momentum showed no signs of slowing. The point of impact had become a crater of destruction. Everything lay in ruins, the ground weakened and collapsing into the depths below. Northern hovered above, glancing down briefly. I'm glad the damage didn't reach the underground shelter. Continuing to fight on land might prove dangerous. The shadow in Thrall launched from the city center, crashed through everything in its path until it slammed into the city walls, sending cracks spreading like spider webs through the Great Wall of South Drywall. The monster crumpled down, blood streaming from various wounds across its body. It slowly rose and spread its wings. The wings were pure shadow, oozing darkness as they unfurled with reckless speed. The monster climbed into the sky and seemed to draw a breath. Its eyes, like pools of liquid darkness, deepened with malice. Then it surged forward like a hurricane's tide. Northern stood suspended in the air, watching as the monster flew toward him from the wall 50 kilometers away. Yet the beast was closing that distance with frightening speed. In less than 30 seconds it would return. Northern remained in the air, his expression ice cold, his eyes blazing with fierce cantaloupe light. When he becomes burning storm, every fiber of his being feels like burning storm. Perhaps it was due to the recent shift in his soul. Feel so. Him yet not quite him. Having a stream of parallel thought designed specifically for this identity made it more manageable. But reflecting on it filled him with dread about what he was becoming. He shut his eyes slowly for a moment and once again he vanished. He closed the distance in less than 5 seconds and slammed into the shadow abomination, unleashing a violent gale that tore outward. The atmosphere seemed ready to collapse. The clouds rolled away from the impact, only for the shockwave to ripple horizontally and slice through them. Moments later, Northern felt the ground tremble violently, almost as if it tilted to one side. A small grin crossed his face. They're raging over there too, I see. The disadvantage, so to speak, of having parallel minds was that he couldn't tell what the others were doing. He could communicate mentally, but he couldn't invade their consciousness without shattering the cognitive flow he had created. Still, he had a vague sense of how things were unfolding. Titan's reckoning was further ahead than he was. That one was utterly demented. He threw himself into battle with no regard for his own body. He possessed savage strength that could lift mountains and a defensive ability that could withstand 10,000 comets. The bastard would have been the strongest name if Burning Storm wasn't the name of a paragon. And the other two clones. Those ones Burning Storm couldn't tell what was happening. Those ones were even more distant than Titan's reckoning. He opened his fist, studying his fingers with a faint smile while floating in the air. I shouldn't dilly-dally. He then gazed down at the crumbled monster that was already rising. Northern plunged toward the beast. A shockwave erupted, instantly rolling across the debris with savage force. However, the strangest thing happened. The shockwave froze mid-flight and returned with equal fury, causing even more devastating damage. Purple blood burst from several parts of the monster. Its body was already healing. Northern grinned wildly. Yes, make it more fun. He sent his fist crashing down, the force of his punch boring into one of the monster's heads, driving a hole clean through the skull that Northern could see straight through. Another head was already lunging toward him. He dodged and spun midair, delivering a crushing kick to the head. The neck twisted away as the impact rang out and suddenly vanished. Northern rolled several more times with intense and impossible speed, practically becoming a blur, then landed another kick. This time the kick completely pulverized the head, turning it into a shower of putrid purple blood. Chapter 1055. Failed Emulation. If I remember correctly, Paragon Rizel had a lethal battle style. Northern whipped his hands forward, momentum shielding them, as he slapped away the shadow monster's head that lashed toward him. His battle style. Can I replicate it? The problem was that he hadn't paid enough attention to Paragon Rizel's combat art. He was just starting to use Demon of Emulation at the time. Besides, a Paragon's combat art was far more terrifying. With the little he'd glimpsed of Eli's technique, Northern couldn't even begin to comprehend how he would unravel Paragon Rizel's intricate and reckless battle art. Making things worse, he hadn't been able to fully glimpse Eli's battle art. Whatever he'd seen was barely surface level. That's why he'd decided to emulate what he could and end the battle as quickly as possible. Of course, either way he would have won. But the fight would have dragged on needlessly. Right now, what he truly wanted to do, even if he couldn't exactly emulate Paragon Rizel's battle art, was emulate something of the same nature. Something that carried the essence of recklessness. Something rooted in understanding his talent's nature, the core and its connection to its name. Northern closed his eyes for a moment as he parried the monsters' heads with bare hands. Each parry caused air to explode around them. The shadow enthrall remained stubbornly persistent. Eyes closed, he recalled how Burning Storm had fought that night in Lithia. While he struggled to remember, his hands moved with their own life, smashing heads with heavy momentum wrapped around his fists. It was as though the air had been forged into a titanic fist, and every time his hand moved, the reinforced air followed, crushing the shadow enthrall's heads as they flew at him. Blood splattered at intervals, but the heads healed at a terrifying pace. The ground fractured, cracks spreading wider as they clashed relentlessly. Northern simply closed his eyes and locked in. His mind wandered to the past, trying to create a stable mental image of what he'd witnessed. One thing he understood: Paragon Rizel's talent was fueled by motion. Therefore his battle art had to follow the same rule. It required constant movement, tremendous force, and endless momentum. Yet none at all. Because while motion served as his talent's essence, stagnation didn't hinder it. Burning Storm gained as much from moving as from standing still. The unfortunate part was that kinetic energy absorbed from stillness couldn't be stored long. It was minimal, but Northern didn't think it should be ignored. He wasn't a genius. He knew how to build houses and roads, understood how structures worked together, and could apply that knowledge to his advantage. But Northern didn't consider himself a genius with motion mechanics, especially something requiring such intricate and delicate exploitation of power, force, and impact. That demanded careful handling, and he knew little about such complexities. Still, he didn't plan to surrender so easily. His eyes remained closed, hands moving in mesmerizing patterns as they blurred, slapping away heads that persistently flew at him. One head pulled back into the air and opened its maw. Northern frowned but kept his eyes shut. Then the monster unleashed a torrent of purple liquid that crashed onto the ground, melting it at an alarming rate. However, Northern didn't move. His entire body was barricaded by a shield of momentum. His eyes remained closed as he thought deeply, mapping out the first series of movements in his mind. He was creating a mental blueprint and transmitting the information to his body. It was like dancing. The difference between those who could dance and those who couldn't was that when visualizing a dance move, the person who couldn't dance lacked the proper movement sequence to execute what they envisioned. That's where the skilled dancer excelled. Even without formal training, they could still execute an envisioned dance move. Northern wasn't a novice fighter, he was skilled. He might lack the mechanics to fully emulate Paragon Rizel's battle art, but he wasn't lacking in combat fundamentals. In fact, he knew those intimately even before Byran had begun teaching him methodically, or before Sura had instructed him that one time. Finally he exhaled and slowly opened his eyes. Cold air flowed from his mouth as he breathed out. The monster had finished its first barrage of melting liquid. 2 more heads had joined the assault, mouths gaping wide. Northern's left foot slowly left the ground. As the head screeched and unleashed a liquid jet, Northern vanished and collided with the neck. He smashed through with brutal force, but in the same breath he moved like a gale. The shockwaves that exploded from all the heads had barely a 1-second interval between them. He landed back on his feet, skidding backward. He looked at the shadow monster, frustration etched across his face. TSK, that was disappointing. He vanished forward and smashed into the monster's chest. His entire body was wrapped in momentum that carved a path. It sliced into the shadow enthrall's body and emerged from the other side with the monster's cores clutched in his hands. He looked back. A massive gaping hole stared back at him from the creature's torn body. Failure. Northern had successfully killed the shadow enthrall, but he'd known he could kill it. His goal had been to somehow emulate Paragon Rizel's battle art and discover how he could use Endless. What exactly Endless was, but this was a failure. Even though he'd slain the monster, the battle art hadn't emerged as he'd envisioned. He was dissatisfied. Both the first and second attempts bore no resemblance to Paragon Rizel's technique. He sighed and watched the monster collapse to the ground, all heads severed, purple blood pooling beneath its massive corpse. He stared toward the west, where he presumed Titan's Reckoning was battling another body. This should be easy. Why isn't he finished? Titan's Reckoning possessed devastating brute strength. This should be the simplest task for him. That's what Northern believed. But somehow he wasn't done. because if he were finished and the other two were as well, Northern would have seen the notification that the monster had been slain. But he wasn't seeing anything yet. This made him exhale as he began walking toward Titan's Reckoning's area. As he continued, he met Titan's Reckoning halfway and frowned. "Asshole, what are you doing?" Titan's Reckoning smiled. "I finished early, so I thought I'd come check on you." His smile infuriated Burning Storm. There was something mocking about that smirk. "Those two nameless assholes must be what's delaying us." "No, they aren't. They actually finished earlier and were recalled by our master." Burning Storm looked at him for a moment and sighed. "Your master, by the way. That incompetent fool could never be my master." He massaged the bridge of his nose and looked around. "If the three bodies have been defeated, then why is the darkness still here?" Titan's Reckoning looked around with a soft smile. It was a question that baffled him too. They'd only found 3 bodies and assumed that defeating them would automatically end this. The darkness would vanish. However, even after defeating all 3 bodies, the darkness persisted. If the darkness isn't vanishing, that simply means we haven't killed the shadow monster. Burning Storm glared. "Think I don't know?" Titan's Reckoning nodded with his ever-present soft smile, which now irritated Burning Storm even more. "Why the hell are you smiling? What are you smiling about?" Titan's Reckoning looked at him, still smiling. "Would you rather I frown like you age quickly and die?" "No thanks. I heard it takes 2 muscles to smile. I strain plenty of muscles when fighting. The last thing I want is to waste 72 making an ugly expression." But then dimwits who ride on momentum and force would never understand what actual momentum and force generators go through. He shook his head and looked away. Burning Storm glared at him, fire practically blazing from his gaze. "You bastard! What did you say? I dare you to say it again." Just as they faced each other ready to clash, the atmosphere of the darkness shifted, making them pause. Both looked at each other with silent understanding. Burning Storm grinned. So did Titan's Reckoning. Both slowly turned, saying in unison, "Monsters. So damn gullible." Burning Storm looked at his hand with a serious expression, then his eyes slowly glowed green. This was the first time his eyes had glowed since Northern got the name. Not only that, the air around him felt scorching. Titan's Reckoning also clenched his fist, ready for battle. The shadow monster had to be somewhere. They'd both figured that out. They'd also realized the bastard had tested them with its clones. That was the only explanation for why the darkness hadn't vanished. Since the monster was intelligent enough to test them, it was probably also cunning enough to exploit their disagreement. And that's where they had it trapped. The bastard revealed its watchful eyes for a moment, and both Burning Storm and Titan's Reckoning sensed it. Of course, neither expected what happened next. First a shadow hydra coalesced from the darkness, then a second, another and another. They continued appearing endlessly, filling the entire landscape. Hundreds of shadow monsters, each with 6 heads, rose into the dark sky, screeching like trapped and demented thunderclaps. Both Burning Storm's and Titan's expressions paled. Oh, crap. Chapter 1056. End of the Shadow Enthrall arc. The hall where they all stood fell silent. Everyone stared at Northern from afar, but none dared approach him. Emotions rippled through the air, etched across their faces. Doubt, displeasure, arrogance, contempt. It was all quite understandable. They had reigned as the strongest in the Therian Citadel. Even when Northern joined, most knew nothing about it because they were scattered across the continent on missions. It was difficult to accept him, yet even more difficult to displace him. Worse still, the boy didn't seem to care. Gordon, however, seemed pretty friendly with Northern already. Northern had gotten the full story of everything that had happened up until this point. He was currently sharing what he knew about the entire disaster unfolding, who Call was and what exactly the bastard wanted to do. With each word he uttered, Thalen's face grew paler. But at some point Northern paused, causing Gordon to ask with a slightly worried expression, "Are you alright, buddy?" Northern's expression drifted out of focus for a moment. Then he blinked and regarded them both with serious eyes. The shadow enthrall. Gordon looked confused at first, but caught on barely a second later. "Oh, what about it? Defeated it already?" Northern frowned. "That's what I would have loved to say, but unfortunately killing that bastard is going to be more difficult than I thought." Gordon flashed his teeth. "Oh? Mind telling me about it?" Northern shifted his gaze to him. "It has more than 3 bodies. Apparently it can create multiple clones. The bastard copied my ability." Gordon's frown deepened, though his eyes remained hidden. The tension showed in his expression. Thalen spoke, his voice thick with concern. "Right, you said you'd fought it once. What exactly happened?" Northern exhaled. "It fled, and seemed to have inherited some qualities of my soul. I think because of that it can do what I was able to do while fighting it." Gordon folded his arms and grinned. "So thanks to you the monster got stronger?" Northern responded flatly. "That's one way to look at it." The 3 fell silent for several seconds. Then Thalen's voice cut through the quiet. "So, what are you going to do?" Northern sighed and his eyes began radiating soft blue light. I might have to step in myself. But don't worry. This won't even take a minute. He looked at Thalen and pointed toward the balcony. Can I use that for a bit? Thalen nodded. You're free to use wherever you like. Northern smiled. Thank you. Then he moved forward with gentle calm steps. He stood at the balcony, leaped and landed softly on the terrace railing. He looked around, his gaze somewhat distant. Then he closed his eyes, trying to extend his spatial awareness as far as possible. Even in this darkness, the wind exists. And the wind is a force that lets me cut. If I simply apply the same principle I used with Black Lance, I think I should be able to do the same thing with the air, without necessarily having to move much. Of course, Northern didn't know at this point that he was beginning to walk the path of the will. Unless you possessed sharpened will, it was impossible to force the wind into action. That's why often drifters with elemental talent could create their own fire, air, or water. Because the forces of the world, however common they might seem, were still forces of the world. They required a will so powerful and tyrannical to be moved. And Northern's will, even though unrefined, was tyrannical enough to make the world tremble in fear. He just never realized it. The wind obeyed him. It was the swiftest, most silent attack Northern had ever executed. He simply made the wind capable of cutting. Every current became a blade that could slice apart both soul and body. As the wind flowed softly, it began severing the soul of every threatening monster. Northern's spatial awareness easily reached where two of his clones were battling. Easy as a walk in the park, the monsters' bodies began falling to the ground with absolutely no visible wounds. Every single one, even the darkness that shrouded them, which was an extension of its soul, Northern was cutting with wind blade. After a few seconds, the wind slowly began to disperse. The dark clouds above them dissipated and light began breaking through. Meanwhile, Northern looked down. Congratulations, you have slain an apex destroyer. You have gained 24 talent fragments. You have slain a creature transformed by Chaos Void and Omniform. You have killed a rare phenomenon, first of its kind. You have gained 1,000 talent fragments. Omniform is absorbing the soul of this creature. Omniform is expanding. Omniform is transforming. This transformation may take a while, however, it will not hinder your activities. Northern frowned. Strange. I guess it only makes sense for Omniform to transform. But why is it going to take time? He sighed and discarded the thought, then turned back to the room. He was almost unnerved by the stares. Everyone was looking at him, shocked, stunned, and disbelieving. Wait, for real? Are you kidding me? Zeke's mouth gaped so wide it looked ready to detach. This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Gordon couldn't defeat it for days. And he, Rank 5 Zaire, was already speaking carelessly before remembering that Gordon was nearby and quickly stopped himself. Nova, leaning on Lyra's shoulder, eyes sparkling, said, but seriously, did this guy just accomplish in 1 minute what we all couldn't do in 3 days? No wonder the headmaster goes all soft around him. Nova, Lyra cautioned, but the Queen of Boom didn't care. Am I lying? He's been all gentle and careful around the boy, right? She looked at the rest of them. Zeke adjusted his glasses. I have no idea what you're talking about. The headmaster seems pretty normal to me. He grinned and bowed gently toward Northern. Kind sir, is there anything you might need? Northern regarded the short boy with a guarded expression. All their gazes had suddenly shifted. They were smiling, either intrigued or struck by curiosity. I'm fine. Thank you for the kind offer. He walked past Zeke politely. You worthless pig, is that what you're going to stoop to? Nova yelled at Zeke. But Zeke merely lowered his glasses slightly and peeked over the top. What do you mean stoop to? I'm merely following the headmaster's example. And pigs aren't worthless. They cost a fortune. Chapter 1057. The Doom War Intro. Day returned to South Drywall, and they could clearly see what remained of the rest of the city. Whatever formation had been used to separate the monsters had proven devastatingly efficient. They owed their lives to it. At the same time, it had left the city in utter ruins. The walls were not as they should be. They had twisted into complicated maze patterns. Buildings looked as though they'd been constructed in labyrinthine designs. Fascinating to behold, yet most had been crushed and torn apart, perhaps when monsters tried to forcefully rip themselves free from the maze. A massive alien ship was gliding toward the center of the city through the air. Northern, Elitis, Thalen, and Gordon stood on the balcony gazing over the devastated city. Thalen wore a sullen expression. What happens from here? Northern's gaze remained indifferent, razor-sharp, with focus and hardened by deep resolve, yet detached all the same. Destruction. His tone, however, carried immense weight. There's going to be nothing but complete annihilation. Thalen looked at him. What do we do? Whatever we can. There are still several other nations being hunted. And I know you have personal business to settle. There aren't many people who can fight in Origin, but if we work together, I'm certain we can stop this. Silence stretched between them. Then Gordon's voice sliced through. He was leaning against the wall behind them. Would it be enough? An origin, we could say, is a force as powerful as all herself. Is there anything we can do that will suffice against it? Isn't it more reasonable to stop him at all costs? Northern felt a flicker of frustration at the question, but he understood, so he couldn't lash out at the poor guy. If there was one thing he'd come to understand recently as he crossed paths with formidable people, it was that everyone strong had earned it. They fought like their lives depended on it, because they did. From Dante to Paragon Rizel to Eli and these men. It was perfectly understandable that they'd be consumed with hesitation. They didn't have a Byran to rely on, or a nebulous lord, or an abyss tyrant. They didn't even know these enigmatic allies of his existed. And even if they did, no one truly grasped the extent of their abilities. It was as though his summons were slowly building and growing for this very moment. And despite everything, he was terrified too. He didn't want to lose his summons. He couldn't bear to lose Abyss Tyrant. They might never speak, but those creatures meant everything to him. Abyss Tyrant was living testimony of his experience. The Nebulous Lord was proof of his struggle and perseverance. Byran was a true friend he'd gained. Revant, even with his rebellious nature, Northern still found compelling and kindred nonetheless. These were his people, his world beyond his parents. If he lost them, he didn't know if he'd ever find the will to continue. And this was how he, who had a fighting chance against an origin, thought. How much more devastating for them who had no chance at all. Northern truly understood their despair. But there was no alternative. This was the only choice presented to them. The only choice they could make. He glanced back at Gordon. It's already too late. Anything we attempt will only advance his plans. Our actions or inactions will push Khal's scheme to release Cryos forward, because whether it's to protect or destroy, conflict is conflict. The bloodshed matters no more and no less, at least to a terrible existence like them. Gordon looked down and sighed. So, it is doom? Northern turned away, his voice heavy with finality. It is doom. The airship descended slowly before the Therian citadel walls. Thalen exhaled deeply. So, what's our next move? Northern sighed. The only reasonable strategy is to split into teams. Send groups to the remaining nations to help them while one team heads toward the Dark Continent. Try to stop Cryos before he reaches the Central Plains. Thalen slapped the terrace railing and stepped back. Well then, we'd better get to work. Thalen and Gordon withdrew from the balcony, leaving Northern and Elitis alone. Elitis stepped forward, hesitating briefly until Northern noticed. Are you all right? He nodded with a respectful bow. Yes, my lord. I'm simply concerned. How did things go? And I might have some crucial information for you. Northern looked at him with interest and smiled. I wouldn't say everything went smoothly. The worst possible scenario was Ruffsburg returning amid this disaster, which happened, and which I faced and somehow survived stronger than before. Northern joked with a bicep flex. Elitis smiled faintly. You. Beyond what I imagined. It's appalling to witness. Northern gave him an odd look. Why say it like that? You sound like you're about to piss yourself. His expression then grew serious. It's ironic. You think I'm strong. Everyone witnesses what I can do and they're shocked, terrified. But I examine my arsenal of skills and consider what's coming for us. And I shake my head at the inevitable ruin. Because we're all still doomed, Elitis. Elitis remained silent, studying him carefully. Northern's eyes sharpened as a thought struck him. He looked up at Elitis immediately. Do you think it's possible to seek support from the Riemgard Empire? This concerns the entire continent. Elitis shook his head gravely. It's futile. Riemgard, as far as I know them, stands to gain the most from the Empire's destruction. Northern frowned. What do you mean? Elitis adjusted his monocle. They've always pursued domination. They only ceased after the establishment of the Old Tower Alliance and the government. But this is also how they isolated themselves. Luingard's existence was meant to advance the same agenda. Regardless of which emperor sits on the throne, I doubt their objectives will change easily. Riemgard is virtually untouchable. They can either intervene at the last minute or not at all. Either way, remaining passive serves them best. Northern's face darkened. Because after this ends, they can resume pushing their agenda. Elitis nodded. Precisely, my lord. Northern burned with righteous fury. What kind of tyrannical nation is that? And to think the ruler of such a place is my true father? Northern realized that another, even more devastating war might follow this one, if they won. But first, they had to survive this battle. He sighed and looked at Elitis. What's the other information you had for me? Elitis adjusted his monocle and moved closer to Northern. It concerns Professor Heimberger. Northern raised an eyebrow. Oh? If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions. just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.